Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another exciting edition of Anatomy and Physiology. This session is going to start our muscle chapter. The muscle notes, as you'll notice from your package from Blackboard, they're kind of long. So they're a little bit longer than what we traditionally have, but we're not going to go through all 114 slides or whatever it is in one session. So there'll probably be 3 different recording sessions over the muscle tissue. The next exam is going to cover the muscle tissue, and it's going to also cover the nervous system. So the good news is you really only have 2 chapters for your next exam. Yay! But the other side of that is that they're pretty hefty chapters. And to be honest with you, the next couple of sessions that we have, or the next couple of units that we cover, muscles and nerves, are my favorite. In fact, the nervous system is my ultimate favorite organ system to ever teach and to discuss and to learn about. And muscles is probably in second place. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the muscle tissue. And remember, I don't know what textbook you have, so depending on the textbook that you have, the muscles, I don't know the page numbers. So the page numbers are going to be different because there are several different versions of the textbook out there that I've allowed for you guys to do, but I believe the chapter stayed the same. So for muscle tissue, this starts at chapter 10. So chapter 10, this is the muscle stuff, and if you have the 8th edition, I know for sure it's page 293, but it changes from then on out. All right, so an introduction into the muscle tissue. Now we're going to do this the same way we did the skeletal system. At first we take a tour of all of the structures that you would find in this organ system. So we'll take a tour and look at some of the different types of cells that we find there, the different types of connective tissue, the role of those connective tissues, the role of those cells. We'll talk a little bit about just kind of what would you find if you were to take the magic school bus into a muscle. So that's kind of how we'll start off. And then as we learn and have understood what these different structures are and what they do, then we're going to press the start button and we're going to sit back in this muscle cell and we're going to watch how everything works. How does the contraction actually take place? How does relaxation actually take place? What is the role of all these chemicals that we just were introduced to on our tour? So we're going to take a step back from it and look at how all of these parts work together in the physiology aspect of it. For most students, the physiology part is the tough part of A&P. The anatomy is fine, because really the anatomy is just memorizing. If you have the dedication to memorize these different structures and the location of these structures and what they look like, you're usually in a really good place. For physiology, you've got to really put your thinking cap on. You're going to have to be able to figure out, how do these things work together? How does Unit A work with Unit B? What happens to Unit B if Unit A is no longer functioning? So it's really putting the pieces in there together. For some people who like to know how things work, that have what we consider an analytical mind, that part is really fun to them. So for me, the physiology is the fun part for me. So sometimes I have students ask me, well, why is it that I can do so well on lab exams, but then I don't do really well on the lecture exams? And the reason for that is because lecture is a little bit of a different beast in A&P, that it's more physiologically based. So right now, we're going to be doing the anatomy-esque portion of the muscle system. We're looking at what these structures are, where they are, and what they do. Towards the middle of this unit, then we will talk about exactly what, how does it all work together, and what happens when one piece doesn't do its job. Is it going to alter everything else in the pathway? All right, so first things first. Keep going on here. Muscle tissue is divided into 3 different types of muscle, and we learned this when we went through all of our different tissue types. If you remember, your body is composed of 4 different types of tissue. Epithelial and connective we have done to death, so you guys are very familiar with that. Bone with connective tissue, blood with connective tissue, cartilage with connective tissue, fat with connective tissue. So all of those things are considered connective tissues. And then we had epithelial tissue, which lines surfaces in the inside of cavities. So skin is an epithelial tissue. Simple squamous epithelial tissue that's found in your lungs, that's epithelial tissue. And now we're going on to the 3rd type of tissue, muscle. And the 4th type is nerves, and we'll talk about that later. And if you remember from chapter 4, we really didn't talk a whole lot about muscle, other than saying we have 3 types, skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. So we are going to spend time on all 3 types of muscle. The cardiac muscle and the smooth muscle we won't spend as much time on, but we will talk about them as an introduction, and you'll have a much deeper discussion of cardiac and smooth muscle and AMP2. So the muscle that we are going to spend pretty much this whole entire chapter talking about is skeletal muscle. And skeletal muscle are attached to the skeletal system. If we did not have skeletal muscle attached to the skeletal system, our skeleton would not be allowed to move. Your skeleton is just your internal framework. It doesn't really do any movement on its own. Yes, it articulates with other bones. Yes, it's able to bear weight. However, it's the muscles that attach to the skeletal system that allow for the movement of the skeletal system. So when we talk about the musculature or the muscular system, that organ system, we're only talking about skeletal muscle. We're not talking about cardiac or smooth muscle. So some jobs or functions of the skeletal muscle, because that's what we're primarily going to discuss in this chapter. We'll have a little bit of cardiac, a little bit of smooth muscle, but for right now we're talking skeletal muscle. It produces skeletal movement. Well, that's kind of a no-brainer. We already established that. It also maintains your body position. So if you want to stick your arm up, keeping your arm up and contracting and maintaining those contractions, that's the job of your muscle. So that's your skeletal muscle that does that. If we did not have skeletal muscle and we were all just skeleton, then we wouldn't be able to put our arm up and keep it up. It also supports your soft tissues. So in places like your abdomen where you don't have any bones there that protect your stomach, your rib cage doesn't come down all the way down low like that. So to protect your abdomen, your stomach, and some of those other soft tissue organs there, you have muscles, your abdominal muscles. You have to protect that area. It also guards openings. So different openings, we call them orifices. So things, intestines leaving out of your body or for places to come in, there are muscles or sphincters that will go around those orifices. Shivering helps to maintain your body temperature, so the muscles will actually rub against one another when you shiver, and it helps to bring your body temperature up, so it has a job in that. And it also stores some nutrients. We're going to find that calcium is a super, super important nutrient that's needed in the body. We've already talked about how we need calcium in the bone. We've already talked about how for bone development, that calcium phosphate and hydroxyapatite, because that's very important, and calcium is stored in the bone. We're also going to talk about the role of calcium in the skeletal muscle. So there is calcium that's reserved here as well. And then we'll talk about calcium again in the nervous system. And then we'll talk about calcium again in the cardiovascular system. So we're going to see that calcium plays a huge role in maintaining homeostasis of your body. So skeletal muscle, and once again, we're just on our tour. So we have gotten off into the skeletal muscle factory, for our magic school bus, and we've noticed here that we have 3 different types of muscle that we can in the body: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. We said cardiac and smooth are going to be on another wing. We're going to focus on the skeletal muscle. We said these are just some of the jobs of the skeletal muscle. Now, as we go into the skeletal muscle itself, here are some of the items that you will see on our tour. Muscle tissue is made up of what we call muscle cells or muscle fibers. Those terms can be used interchangeably. That we can call it a muscle cell or we can call it a muscle fiber. We're also going to find various connective tissues associated with the skeletal muscle system, primarily in the form of dense connective tissue, in the form of tendons, because the tendons connect the muscle to the bone. We also find nerves, because we need a good nerve supply here, because the skeletal muscle moves under conscious control to tell me to put my arm up or to put my arm down. Those commands have to come from my central nervous system, so there will be lots and lots of nerves here. And then because skeletal muscle has so much activity that it does, we're going to have a really good blood supply, because we're going to need to get oxygen and we're going to need to get nutrients to these muscles in order for them to facilitate their duties, in order for them to facilitate their job. So these are some of the structures that we will see, and we'll talk about how each and every one of these structures plays a role in getting skeletal muscle to work. And a working skeletal muscle is one that contracts. We need it to contract, we need it to relax. So that's the overall goal of skeletal muscles. What we're doing now is just a build-up to that goal. We want muscles to contract. That's the goal. And we want them to relax. How does that happen? Well, it's going to take the job of these structures here, plus a couple of more. So this is just kind of an outline of where we're going. So when we look at the organization of the skeletal muscle, it's a lot more complex than we may have originally thought. For example, muscles have 3 layers of connective tissue or collagen fibers that go around them. First, when we first walk onto a skeletal muscle, we're going to encounter the epimysium. So that's just that external layer of collagen fiber. It's going to be connected to your deep fascia. We talked about that in chapter 4 about the different layers of the body. And this is what separates the muscle from all the other surrounding tissue. So it's kind of enclosed in its own little sac, or what we call the epimysium. Now, if we go past the epimysium, then we notice that each one of the muscle fiber bundles are groups of muscle cells. That's what a muscle fiber bundle is, or fascicle. That surrounding each one of these fascicles is another layer of collagen, and this is called your perimysium. Here at this perimysium, this is where you're going to have blood vessels and nerves supplying nervous innervation and blood and nutrients and all the stuff that comes with blood and oxygen, all that good stuff, that's going to be coming to this area in order to supply these nutrients and to supply these nerves to the fascicles. And remember, a fascicle is just a bundle or groups of muscle cells together. So epimysium surrounds the entire muscle. Get a little bit closer, you're going to see various different perimysiums that will surround individual groups of cells, or what we call fascicles. And then if we go into one of those perimysiums, we'll see the endomysium. The endomysium is going to surround an individual muscle cell. Or, remember, we can use the term muscle fiber interchangeably. So it's going to surround an individual muscle fiber. In this area, we're going to find smaller blood vessels that we call capillaries, the actual nerve fibers that have a synapse or a connection with the individual muscle cells. And then you also find in this area the stem cells that are required to repair damage to muscle cells. And we call those myosatellite cells. So when we look at this up close, oops, what you said? So here's a picture of all of those things that we just talked about. So we're going to go into Rod's muscle here. We notice that when we go into his muscle, it's surrounded by this connective tissue of collagen, the epimysium. And if we go a little bit further, we see that we have this muscle fascicle that's surrounded by the perimysium. And if we go, so this is we took one of these and we blew it up. So that perimysium has multiple muscle cells found inside of it. So in this fascicle, or this bundle of muscle cells, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 muscle cells that are in there. If we just take one of those muscle cells, we notice that it's surrounded by the endomysium. And then that endomysium has that myosatellite cell there. It surrounds just the individual muscle cells. So just the individual muscle cell is surrounded by this the endomysium. It's just surrounded by this endomysium here. So each one of these little red dots there, they're going to be filaments that we talk about in just a little bit. So we haven't really introduced all of these parts of the muscle cell just yet, but we're getting to them. So we're just introducing how they're wrapped up together. So for now, understanding that we have the epimysium that surrounds all of the fascicles. What's a fascicle? A bundle of muscle cells. We have the perimysium that surrounds a group of muscle cells. And then we have the endomysium that surrounds an individual cell. Big important aspect of the endomysium I want you to take home right now is that there's a myosatellite cell there. And the job of that myosatellite cell is to ensure that muscles can be repaired, that they can be repaired if they're broken down. So it's a stem cell. So how do all of these layers, the peri, the epi, the endomysium, how do they all connect with one another? Well, at the end of the muscle cells, you're going to notice that all of these layers, endo, peri, and epimysium, they come together to form the connective tissue, or the tendon, that attaches the muscle to the bone. So those connections are nice and tight. The perimysium, the endomysium, and the epimysium are all made out of the exact same type of connective tissue, collagen. And so it all forms and comes together at the end of those muscle cells, or the end of that muscle, and it attaches itself to the bone. So that attachment, the collagen from that tendon, because now we're going to call it a tendon, attaches itself to the bone itself. Now, that attachment is so strong that you're more likely to rip a tendon in half or to rip a muscle than you are to actually rip that tendon out of the muscle, to pull it out completely, because it's a very, very, very strong connection. The collagen fibers in the bone are going to meet up and fuse with those very strong collagen fibers in that tendon. So a tendon is just a bundle of this connective tissue, this connective tissue that attaches the muscle to the bone. An aponeurosis, and we'll look at the aponeuroses in the skull when we look at do the axial skeleton, the bones and muscles of the skull and the vertebrae. Those are more flat, broad sheets, but they're still made out of the same dense connective tissue of collagen. So nerves, as we said, are also going to go there because very important that you remember, and you probably knew this already, but just to drive home here, skeletal muscle are voluntary. That means that you consciously control whether you want to move your leg, curl your toes, put your hands up, scratch yourself, whatever it is that you want your body to do, dance, run, even singing. All of that is controlled by your nervous system, your central nervous system being in fact, your brain and your spinal cord. So your skeletal muscles are voluntary muscles, and they're controlled by the nerves of your central nervous system. Cardiac and smooth muscle are involuntary. You don't have to consciously think about heartbeat, heartbeat, heartbeat. It kind of does that on its own. It's a different part of your nervous system that's responsible for that. So that's what we consider involuntary control. Voluntary control means that you can control, you consciously think about moving your muscles to where they need to go. As a result, there should be a lot of nerves that come to these muscles in order to facilitate those commands to move your muscles whatever way you want to go. Also, there are lots of blood vessels there. Muscles have an extensive vascular system. Whenever you see that term vascular, I want you to think lots and lots and lots of blood vessels. So there are lots of blood vessels that go into the muscles. And we need lots of blood vessels because we need lots of oxygen. Oxygen is important for any cell that has to do work. And remember what the overall goal was of the muscle cells? Contraction? That's quite a bit of work. So we need lots of oxygen in order for muscle cells to do their work. We also need lots of nutrients, things like glucose, things like other carbohydrates, proteins. We need lots of nutrients for these muscles to do their work, because every time you tell your muscle from your brain and spinal cord to put your arm up, there are chemicals. Oxygen is required, nutrients are required, calcium is required in order for it to do that job. So we take it for granted that our arm goes up whenever we want it to go up. But we have to keep in mind that there's a lot of stuff that's happening on a biochemical level that's keeping this process going. And we'll look at exactly what that stuff is. Maybe not in today's lecture, but very soon. We also have supply minerals, we talk about supply nutrients, and even carry waste. So after you do all that working out, there are going to be some waste products that are there. So the waste is going to be carried by the blood vessels to places like the liver, where we'll take care and handle that waste. So going back to looking at a skeletal muscle fiber, also known as a skeletal muscle cell, remember those terms are used interchangeably. They're very long. They develop through fusion of myoblasts. Those are the cells of, remember, blasts are building cells, like osteoblasts were bone building cells, muscle, blast, building cells, myoblasts, muscle builders. They develop through myoblasts. And that's why they become so very large, and they have hundreds of nuclei in them. So lots and lots and lots of nuclei, very big. They're much larger than a cardiac or a smooth muscle cell. So if we're looking at how this evolution or the formation of muscles will happen, is that we start off with these individual myoblasts. These myoblasts will fuse together, and that's why muscle cells have, so there'll be several myoblasts that fuse together. That's why muscle cells have hundreds of nuclei, because there's several myoblast cells that are fused together. Some of them don't become muscle cells, they're stuck as myosatellite cells. So he doesn't actually get fully differentiated into, and differentiation just means turned into. So he doesn't get fully turned into a muscle cell because we need him to kind of, some of them, to kind of hang out and wait, and just in case we have to repair this muscle cell. So they'll just be a myosatellite cell. So we have this muscle fiber that will eventually get very elongated, and as it becomes more and more elongated, it becomes a mature muscle cell fiber. On the inside of that muscle cell fiber, so we're going to work our way from the inside out, we find what we have are these little red dots that we call myofibrils, or filaments. These myofibrils are directly result in the actual contraction of the muscle. So we got lots of these proteins of myofibrils, and they're the specific types of filaments, and we'll give them a name in just a second. But for right now, just note they're myofibrils. You have lots of mitochondria. Remember, your mitochondria is the powerhouse of your cell. It generates a lot of energy. And as we established before, getting a muscle to contract is an energetically expensive process. It requires nutrients, requires oxygen. It also requires a mitochondria. So we have lots of mitochondria in this area. We also have several nuclei, which we talked about already. In addition, we have the sarcolemma, which is just the plasma membrane of a muscle cell. Sarco means flesh. I can't remember if it's Greek or Latin, so one of the two. Greek or Latin, so sarco means flesh, so that's how they kind of characterize a lot of the portions of skeletal muscle. They'll put sarco on top of it. So the sarcolemma is just a fancy way of saying plasma membrane of a muscle cell. It's the exact same thing as the plasma membrane, has the exact same components that any old regular phospholipid bilayer of a cell would have. And it's just a bigger picture of all that together. And even more. So when we want to organize that muscle fiber or muscle cell on the inside, some of this we've already talked about. We talked about how the sarcolemma is just the plasma membrane on the outside of the muscle cell. So keep in mind, we're still in our tour. We still have yet to turn this muscle cell on. We are just looking at some of the components of it. And just as a recap on where we've been on our tour, we said an individual muscle is surrounded by the epimysium. That epimysium contains fascicles, or bundles of muscle cells that are surrounded by their perimysium. If we go into one perimysium, we see that there are individual muscle cells found in that perimysium. If we take one of those out, it is surrounded by the endomysium. The endomysium, the perimysium, and the epimysium all fuse at the ends of the muscle cells and form a tendon or an aponeurosis. And then if we were to go into an individual muscle cell, coming from the outside in, the first thing we would encounter would be the sarcolemma. Sarcolemma is just a fancy name for the plasma membrane. If we go past the plasma membrane, we see that it's inside that muscle cell is sarcoplasm. Sarcoplasm is the exact same thing as cytoplasm. So what you know about cytoplasm is being the gunk that's on the inside of the cells that kind of everything swims in, same thing. It's just gunk inside a muscle cell. Now the sarcolemma and the sarcoplasm are very important because at this area here, this is where we have a change in transmembrane potential that begins the contraction. Going back to when we walk through the doors of this muscle, we said the overall goal of a muscle cell, the job that it has to do, is to contract. So right now, this is the first time that we've actually really used that term, contraction, in our notes. We've kind of said it out loud, but we have just now, it's our first time that we said anything about contraction. So at this point here, we're going to start talking about individual structures within the cell that will help directly to fulfill this, this goal of contraction. Now, when we say a change in transmembrane potential, things that I want you to remember are that there are different charges on the outside of a cell than there are on the inside of the cell. So that potential energy is as a result of those change in charges. So the a resting cell is always going to be a negative 70 millivolts. So when I say a cell that's resting, that's going to be just a cell that doesn't do any work. So a cell at rest, a cell that, in this case, if we're talking skeletal muscle contraction, a cell that's at rest, if we were to stick an electrode in there and measure the electrical activity within the cell, it would be negative 70 millivolts. So in order for that cell to demonstrate or show how we would measure that it's done work, that means that we have to have a change in this potential, a change in this negative 70 number. So a change in this negative 70 number would go from a negative number to a positive number. So this change in transmembrane potential, once we have a change that happens, then we're going to have some work that's done. Because very important to remember, a cell that's at rest is at about negative 70 millivolts if we were going to measure the electrical activity inside of that cell. Very, very, very important to remember. Remember, negative 70 millivolts for a cell that's at rest. So also what we find in here is that we have, I hope I've been talking this whole time. Okay. We're going to pause this recording real quick. How long was I talking? Shit. No. Okay, let's stop this session and we're going to do this again.